Hello to our listeners and everyone watching. Welcome to City Arts and Lectures. My name is Chan'Cellore Makanjuola. I'm a student at UC Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism, and I'm also the co-chair of the National Association of Black Journalists UC Berkeley Chapter. This is the first ever co-production with the Journalism School and City Arts and Lectures, and I'm so excited to welcome our guest, Kamau Bell. He's a comedian, host, and executive producer of the CNN docu-series United Shades of America. Welcome, Kamau.
Thanks for having me.
Well, how are you doing? It's pretty like,
No, I mean, I'm doing better than I think 99% of the country. My family's fine. We have, while we have struggled, nobody has gotten COVID, from my 2-year-old daughter to my 83-year-old mother. So I feel very safe and protected in that way. And, because my work is to talk about the problems in America, I'm also still employed. So, I'm still here.
That's good. That's good. I'm so happy to be here with you too. And since you also mentioned, of course, like the work that you're doing, I'm pretty sure you've been busy, obviously, over like the past year. You're currently filming your new season of United Shades of America, and your latest season is out now. And so I just want to know, what has that been like filming during the pandemic, and what topics do you plan to cover?
It's funny. I just got off a phone call with the showrunner, Sandy, Sandy. And we were talking about how we are filming in a couple weeks in South Carolina, and the COVID numbers are going up all around the country, but they're especially going up in red states with poor leadership. So, and Lindsey Graham's from South Carolina, Lindsey Graham, the senator. So that means South Carolina is a red state with poor leadership. So we have to take that into account of filming. So, and it's not just about, I'm certainly more tested than President Trump. I get tested quite often. And the crew gets tested, but we also are interacting with people we test people who are being interviewed on the show, but you can't test everybody. And, we hire local crews. And so it's a lot. It's a lot of stress that hopefully you'll see some of it on camera, but hopefully you won't see all of it on camera. But it's a lot to be doing work right now. But I also know that even being out in the world doing that work, I think about like my CNN colleagues who are actual journalists who have to go to the hot spots and don't have all the access to all the great testing things that I have, and that they just have to sort of be journalists and do the work and hope for the best, and while they are safe, so I'm still in a privileged position even in doing this work.
Yeah, and one of the reasons why I also wanted to talk to you too, especially with your show United Shades. I'm a huge fan of it, and it's a good thing that of course you're filming a new season, hooray! And one of the things I really like about the show is how you're able to talk about what some people might consider very uncomfortable conversations around race. You're addressing systemic racism, white privilege, and kind of breaking that down for viewers on your show. And so at the journalism school, one of the things that we've been discussing here is the role of media and confronting racial biases within the field. And as a person working for a news company or in the news, in the media currently, what are your thoughts on how journalists and the media covers Black issues and movements such as Black Lives Matter?
I think we live in a great time in that we don't have just 3 main news channels anymore. So that means that if you want accurate information, it is certainly out there, and there are journalists who are doing good work to present you with accurate information. So I think, talking to journalists, you should always have more than one source for your story, and I think you should always have more than one source for your news. So I think there is a benefit to knowing what mainstream journalism is talking about, and when I put CNN into that category. And there's also a benefit to know what journalists who don't have the support of the mainstream dollars are doing, who are also trying to tell the stories. So I think for me, the mainstream media can always do a better job of coloring Black, Indigenous, people of color and telling our stories. One of the things that came out quickly after COVID was how our communities were being impacted harder by that. And a lot of the mainstream media and a lot of the politicians at the top of this country are like, why is that Black communities are more impacted by COVID? And certainly Black people don't have to be journalists to know why that's happening. But thankfully, there are journalists out there who are already telling those stories. So I would say it's important to make sure that you don't just expect to get all the news from one place, even if you like that place.
Absolutely. And another thing too, because like you're a comedian and you're working for like a network like CNN too, like which is a journalism like news network, is there a way that you're able to talk about race-based issues within those two mediums, like when you're doing stand-up comedy and then when you're like on the show like doing United Shades?
I mean, yes, when I do stand-up comedy, I can be a little looser. I can be a little freer with I can sort of use it's the reason stand-up comics want to do stand-up comedy is because it's fun and a little bit forbidden. Don't say those things out loud. So there is an aspect of stand-up comedy where it's like, it's great to not be fact-checked and have lawyers go over it. It's great to just sort of talk freely. But the thing that happens with the show that I also love on United Shades of America is that I have a team of people who can make sure that my opinions are backed up by facts. And I appreciate that. So that when I say things about like institution, like we did with our first show this year, it was set in Pittsburgh and it was about structural and institutional racism and white supremacy. And on the show, when I said things like white supremacy is not a feeling, it's not a person, it's a structure. And then we had a segment where we talked about newsrooms specifically in Pittsburgh, about how there's still over 70% at the time, I think 70% white-led newsrooms. So no matter how many people of color in there, the final decisions often end up in the hands of white people. And so it's great for me to sort of go, I know this is true, I've observed this, and then there's like producers and standards and practices who go over it and go, yes, these are the numbers. So it's great to have that staff of people help support my arguments.
Mm-hmm. And that actually is like one of my favorite episodes too, aside from your KKK episode, your very first one that you've done. Of course, I'm pretty sure you've been asked that a million times to talk about it, but that seems to be like your full circle kind of episode where you're kind of going back to, well, not going back to it, but like actually like addressing this even further too. And the fact that it premiered like within the midst of like the Black Lives Matter protest over the summer, like what was that like? Because it's still, it's obviously so relevant, but it felt like you'd been working on it specifically for that moment. Like almost coincidental.
Well, it's funny that you say that because when we first started conceiving about like it was sort of pitched as a follow-up to the KKK episode. And I think there was some sense of like, hey, let's get some of that KKK interest again, because it was very clickbaity, the first episode. Mm-hmm. And I was just very clear, I'm not going to go meet with the Ku Klux Klan again. I'm not going to go do a Where Are They Now Klan edition of United Shades of America. The conversation has evolved since then. My own understanding of white supremacy has evolved a lot. That was since 5 years ago. And so I was very clear, like, we can talk about white supremacy. And me and the producer, M.O., said, let's talk about the structure. And so we were very sort of wedded to that idea. And there was some pushback sometimes from people working on the show about like, you can be a smart, intelligent, well-read, studied person and still not understand that white supremacy is a system. And so we had a lot of internal discussions about like that from people who didn't really understand that. And we had a lot of like back and forth and like, well, can it be this? Can it be this? And like, well, why are you saying this? And then we'd send articles about, well, this is what all these journalists have said about white supremacy being a structure. And then George Floyd was murdered by the cops in Minneapolis. And then the country in many parts rose up and the world rose up against America's history of policing that ends up with the death of Black people and indigenous folks and people of color under circumstances where they should not die. Mm-hmm. And then suddenly we had a much easier time making the argument. So the episode took on a whole new meaning in the middle of making it, which also gave it some energy because we felt like people are going to pay attention to this in a different way, sadly, because George Floyd and, of course, others have been killed since George Floyd. But it gave the episode some energy behind it, and fuel that we knew people would pay attention to it. And also, we then could actually use some of the news footage about that was happening to sort of give the episode really ripped from the headlines relevance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when you're making episodes like these too, like for example, like even your KKK one, but also like this, like the one about like what do we talk about when we talk about white supremacy. Who is your audience? Like, what audience do you typically have in mind for these? Because it seems like very obviously it's educational. You're breaking down like the structures of like white supremacy and like who are white supremacists. And so yeah, who are the people that you have in mind?
I'm aware of there's two audiences. Every show has two audiences, and you have to. And I feel like I have to sort of understand at each moment in the show who I'm talking to. And so with that episode in particular, a lot of that information I know. I don't, like I said, I don't have the facts and figures for it, but I know it. And so it's important for me to let the audience know this is not my first rodeo with white supremacy. So I get to have some opinions here in ways that I'm not going to have the same type of opinions in an episode about like the Sikh community, SIKH, the Sikh religion. So I'm not gonna have strong opinions in that episode about the Sikh community as I am gonna have an episode about white supremacy and how it's affecting Black people in America. So I get to lean into that episode. It's important for me that the people I respect, the people who've educated me, the people, the sort of the I hate the word woke, but let's just use it. The woke Black folk who are in my audience, they don't feel like that I'm doing it at a one-on-one like a 101 level, like an intro. It can't be an intro.
Like a classroom, like an introductory class. Yeah.
We're way past that. And so I want them to know, like, I'm going deep here. Don't worry, I got your back. And at the same time, when there are those 101 moments, I want them to be done in such a way that the people who already know that information go, oh, I've never seen it presented this way. Thank you. I'm going to take that and use that. So I feel like it's in some ways giving tools to the people who already know the information, because now they have a new tool in their toolbox, which is what happened in the episode when we did a breakdown of white supremacy as if it was or of racism as if it's an iceberg. Mm-hmm. That graphic has been used a lot by people. But then there's also the audience who's watching the show, and this is true of no matter what the episode, who's like, I've never heard of this. I don't know anything about it. I'm just sort of still sitting at my TV. Wolf Blitzer just went off the air. Wolf, WOLF, Blitzer, BLITZER. He just went off the news, so I'm going to just keep watching. Why is this Black guy yelling at me? So it's important for me to sort of bring those people along slowly enough that they feel engaged in the material. And that's where humor comes in. That's why during interviews, even though I'm a comedian, I don't talk a lot. I let the other people talk because they're the ones whose stories need to be heard. And so I'm always sort of going back and forth between the audience who has no knowledge about this and for the audience for whom this is like very much like stuff they've heard before, but trying to give it to them in a way that feels helpful to them and explaining it to people who don't know anything.
And yeah, you mentioned your humor and like the comedic aspect. I guess you try to like insert into that. And why do you think, I guess, the intersection between like, comedy and of course the race-based issues that you're talking about is such like a powerful tool or a powerful space that you're in?
I mean, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, if those giants will let me stand on their shoulders. This is not, I'm not inventing anything. I'm just sort of building on the work of comedians. I specifically think of someone like Dick Gregory, D-I-C-K. Gregory is G-R-E-G-O-R-Y. For people, I'm spelling for the ASL interpreters. So I think about because of Dick Gregory, who at some point was like, I'm a comedian who talks about race. And then someone was like, no, that's actually not a good use of my time. I need to be an activist who happens to be funny. And so I look at Dick Gregory's story, and while I still think of myself as a comedian, I think the media landscape has changed where there is more space for people. Like if Dick Gregory was young now, he could have his show that did all the things he wanted to do in a way that he didn't have access to in the 50s and 60s. Like there was no space for a Black guy who cared about Black issues and was trying to be funny on TV regularly like there is now for me. So I think about lots of comedians who came before me doing this work and lots of activists. And I was reading the Autobiography of Malcolm X. The thing that I came away with was how funny he was. Malcolm X was hilarious. And so I think about how humor is always necessary to communicating any idea, even if it's not about race or racism. Just if you want to communicate effectively, we all know that if people laughing, they're paying attention. And so that can work with your boring sales meeting. It can work with your TED talk. And it also works great when you're trying to talk about the fundamental issues in this country and how they're broken and how we need to fix them.
And do you feel that people are more obviously like willing to open up to you when you're, I guess, like coming from your background like in comedy too, and you're talking about more serious issues? Is it a bit easier to talk to people, or like those who have like really hard beliefs about something, do they open up a bit more?
I have learned over time that the humor is essential to having these conversations. When I first started doing the show, I felt like, is it going to be weird if I try to make a joke? Should I not make a joke? Should I try to be serious because these are serious issues? And then I very quickly learned that the reason why people would get to places with me that they wouldn't get with a regular journalist or, maybe even their friends was because I knew how to sort of like keep it funny, keep it moving, keep the conversation going. And we all have made those jokes at a time where it felt like no joke should be made that makes us feel better. So, and also a lot of that is about what I do even before we start taping the interview. If I have time, to sit down with the person and just introduce myself and say, how you doing and how's your day? That gets the conversation going already. If I just sit down cold, a lot of times that doesn't work as well. Now during COVID, we've had to do more of that because you're just trying to limit contact. But even then, at the first few moments of the interview, I'm not thinking about the cameras. I'm thinking about, I'm sitting across from this person. I need to let them know that I see them as a person, it's the difference between, in TV, a lot of times the person feels like they're lucky that TV showed up. And I want that person to know, no, we're lucky you wanted to talk to us.
That is a really great way to see things. Also, kind of along those lines too, like even though obviously like you're a comedian and you have like your own show that you're hosting, in some ways, do you consider yourself a journalist? I mean, you're traveling the country, you're interviewing people, you're writing like a lot of more so like think pieces, and even though you do share your opinions, you're a bit more vocal about your opinions. I guess like has that journalism bug like rubbed off on you a bit? Do you ever feel like I think I'm one?
I mean, I get described as a journalist a lot, and I sort of am used to it at this point. CNN didn't hire me to be a journalist. I think they maybe got more than they bargained for with me. I think they're happy with it. They've won several awards because of the work that we've done together. Yeah. I know they're happy with me. I don't want to be coy. So I think that the idea being that like when I grew up, a journalist was, Dan Rather. Well, even Dan Rather shares his opinion now. But like the Dan Rather that I knew when I grew up was just a newsman. Or you think about like I'm old enough to sort of have fleeting memories of Walter Cronkite. And so I think I see journalists often struggling with, am I allowed to put my opinion in here? But I think the Trump era has really flushed a lot of that away. And I'm happy for that because I do think that we have to stop pretending that facts are immutable things that don't tell a story. I think facts tell a story. And if you're not honest about the story they're telling and not honest about the winners and losers in that story, then I don't think you're actually practicing good journalism. If you're just like when I hear journalists, and I still hear this now, say things like, why would President Trump say that? Why would President Trump do that? As if they're trying to figure out why he's not acting like a president, when the fact is, because he doesn't care about us. And I need you as a journalist to be honest about the fact that we're in rarefied territory here. This is not something that we should act like it's just like, well, this is just how he is the president. And so for me, when I still hear journalists sort of like have this sort of distance of like, and then the president said something that was completely wrong and anti-science. I wonder why he would do that. Because he's a harmful individual. And so that's the thing that keeps me away from the journalism label, because I don't want to be anybody to ever think that I don't have an opinion. However, I am inspired by many journalists who have opinions. But I also understand that journalism is a job, so that when the title of this thing was race and journalism, I'm like, I am making some journalists angry that they're talking to me about journalism. But at the same time, the show is backed up by journalistic research and the integrity of like making sure that we're telling the stories accurately and we have the right information, and we will change things when we get things wrong.
I think that also kind of like plays into, well, even over the summer too, that there was this, I was reading like articles where people were saying like Black journalists are having a reckoning over objectivity and, how far can you, like, I guess, share your opinions or like say that, oh yeah, this is wrong, or when you're saying things like, well, why does the president say something like this, or trying to play this both sidesism? I mean, I guess in your opinion, like when you're watching the news and like listening to journalists who say that, I guess, should they be more vocal about like what they're opposed to? I know a lot of them are doing that now, but in the beginning they weren't. I guess trying to maintain this objective stance. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about President Trump for a second. We can talk about him for all the seconds if we need to. I sent this tweet out yesterday, not that I'm bragging about my Twitter feed, but right now, what Trump is doing in the White House, I was like contractors in the tri-state area of New York who worked with him 30 years ago could have told you he was going to do this and told you he was going to do this. You know, women that he sexually assaulted said he predicted this. The exonerated five predicted this. You know, black people who couldn't get black people who he would not allow to rent apartments in his buildings in 1973 could have told us this. Not could have, did tell us this. We didn't listen to those people. And so for me, when I hear journalists say, why would he do this? It's like, you're not doing good journalism right now, because the book was written on Trump. Literally, Trump wrote a book that he didn't write. And the guy who wrote that book told us that Trump was this guy when he was running for president. So for me, it doesn't seem to be good journalism if every day you wake up like you're in the movie Memento and you're starting from fresh, like what's going on today? You know, like what is the news today? For people who haven't seen Memento, it's about a guy with short-term who has no long-term memory. So every day he wakes up and it's like he's starting from zero and has to piece it all together. And I think
or
a lot
Groundhog
of journalists,
Day, maybe.
Yeah, it's Groundhog Day. Yeah,
Yeah.
And except in Groundhog Day, he knew it was Groundhog Day. In Memento, he didn't know it was Groundhog Day. So I think that I get frustrated when it feels like every day there's journalists who wake up like, what is President Trump doing today? And to me, that's not good journalism. I'm happy about the fact that I don't claim the journalism label and claim the comedian label means I'm always allowed to have an opinion and don't have to feel awkward about it. I feel bad for black journalists who are in that position of like, I want to tell the truth, but I also want to pay my rent. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a position black people find themselves in all across this country, across all sorts of industries, whether it's at McDonald's or Walmart or the New York Times or, you know, or Uber. I want to tell the truth. I want to represent myself well. I want to support my community. I want to speak out against injustice. I also need to pay my rent. I feel very privileged that part of paying my rent is telling the truth as I see it.
Mm-hmm. And of course, well, now that we're approaching the end of the Trump presidency, so I'm pretty sure, yeah, I'm pretty sure you've noticed, like, especially over the past 4 years, like journalists of color, particularly black journalists, have been verbally attacked by the president. And of course, like those in Congress, like whatever political party that they're on. And journalism itself has been under attack too. Like people are calling it fake news, or people aren't really believing that, like, you know, what they're hearing on the news is the truth too. And so I just want to know, with some people seeing like journalism or journalists, the media as the enemy, what do you think about the future of journalism moving forward too in this environment?
I think journalists have to understand, especially the next generation of journalism, that the era of not having an opinion or not telling the truth as you see it is gone. And that if you are a journalist who comes up and sort of acts like that like, you know, on one side we have this, and on the other side we have that, then you're going to be on the wrong side of history. And right now we are living, as I've said before, we are living in the part of history that they write about. A friend of mine jokes that like this era is so thick with information and history that there's going to be people who base their whole careers on like 1 hour on a Friday because there's just so much news happening. And so I think that like, be aware, and I'm aware of this too. This is the time where you find out which side of history you're on. We like to look at World War II and talk about the Germans and what were they doing and what were the German citizens doing. And then we like to sort of put people on which side of history they were on. Well, people are going to be doing that with us. And so I think it becomes really clear, especially the tools of journalism are supposed to be about, in my mind, getting the truth out. And then I define it as getting out the voices of those who can't get their voices out themselves. So that automatically means you're not over-indexing on corporate interests and wealthy people and people who have millions and millions of Twitter followers, you're automatically going to people who can't get their voices out any other way. And those are always going to be the oppressed people, people of color, indigenous folks, and black folks. And if you're not doing that, then I think you're going to find yourself on the wrong side of history.
And also, like, and I guess to like bring that a bit forward too, you've seen now, like with the era of social media too, people are getting their news like they're not just from like the news, either they're getting it from online, like some people are only on Twitter, or like they might be even like younger generations like getting it from TikTok. And so I just want to know, in what ways are you, I guess, expressing like your are you able to talk about, and this is like even going into more like race-based, like the topics that you're talking about, how do you approach that differently when you're on TV versus online?
How do I approach what I say or how I act? Or
Oh yeah, like in terms of like when you're discussing like race-based issues, yeah, is there a different way that you approach it, like when you're on TV, or even doing your docu-series versus like, you know, when you're on social media doing that?
Yeah, I mean, I think every platform has its own way of its own form of interaction. So, you know, there are certainly times on Twitter where I'm like, I'm gonna say this thing and see how people respond to it. You know, like I'm purposely like sort of like poking the bee's nest, and sort of having fun with it in a way that like that I will do that if I'm on CNN sometimes, but I'm also understanding that I'm there to do a very specific thing. I'm only on there for a few minutes. I have to be clear about what I want to say, and I have to rep for the people who put me there. So if I'm on there to talk about an episode that's about education, like I take it seriously. I'm gonna still try to be funny if I can, but it's also not. It's not a place to just have to be immature. But yeah, I certainly, as a comedian, have a deep wellspring of immaturity inside of me, and figure out ways to put that out into the world. So like, that's the other thing about holding on to being a comedian. It means you can just be silly for the sake of being silly, or just say things that you know are inappropriate, but you just want to say them because that's the fun part.
And another one of my questions too is, so this is actually like kind of going back to one of your episodes when we're talking about like the KKK, your very first one. And so basically there's some topics that we have at the journalism school in terms of who we should be giving a platform to, or who we should be like, you know, talking to. So when you're talking to, I guess, like, you know, white supremacists, or even like now like conspiracy theorists, if they're coming from QAnon or like alt-right members, how do you approach that in terms of like the people that you talk to? Because obviously they're out there, they exist, and they have a presence like online sometimes. And so yeah, I do want to know, like, in what ways do you think it's okay, I guess, to approach that, or like how much attention should be given to them?
I mean, first of all, I think everybody has a different level to which they think that's okay, and or what. So, and I think for me, it has evolved. So, the fact that I did the KKK episode initially was about like, I wanted to do something that I've never done before and see if I can pull it off, and then see if I can put it on TV in a way that is helpful, that is sort of like entertaining and informative. And I immediately, once it was on TV, I realized that there are some black people who have no appetite for the KKK, no matter how entertaining or informative you want to make it, and aren't even going to take the time to watch it. Or if they watch it, they're going to be so sort of like not into it that they're not even going to be able to take in the parts that they might enjoy. And I 100% respect that, and I'm not ever going to tell somebody they're wrong for that. So I learned that was something I learned, which then informed, like when we did the white supremacy episode years later, I was like, yeah, I'm not doing that again. There's no part of me that goes, I'm going to go back, because I understood what those people were saying, and I already did it. Like, I just feel like it's already out there. And the deeper level of that is because I didn't have the same level of control over the show then that I do now. There's things in that episode that I don't agree with. that if I had had more access to the edit, I would have said, can we take this out? Can we move this over here? It would have still been an episode about the KKK, but it would have been substantially different. But I was new. There were no other black people in leadership on the show. There was nobody I could turn to and say, you got my back. And the people who were running the show did the best they could and thought they were doing the best job, but didn't treat me like I was a producer. And I've been very vocal about that. So for me, like, I've talked to Richard Spencer. I got a lot of pushback from the left about I shouldn't have this was after Trump was elected. Richard Spencer, they said I normalized him and that I was giving him a platform. And I was like, the episode is mostly about why immigration and refugees are important to this country. And there's like 7 minutes or 42 minutes that are with Richard Spencer. And so for me, it's like, I don't think you watched the whole episode, but I sort of have accepted this is what I do for a living. Sometimes I don't make people happy, and I don't think, but I'm not in the business of making people happy. I'm in the business of actually like telling the story I want to tell. So, and now, but yeah, I'm in a different place in my career. I don't know that I would see the value in sitting down with a QAnon person. Like, I don't know that I would see the value in, like, I can talk about the ideas, but I don't think I see the value in sitting down with somebody from QAnon, because I think they're doing a pretty good job of getting their ideas out there. But I also don't see the value of sitting down with an interview with President Trump either. So, you know, some people would think like, well, he's the president, you should talk to him. But I was like, no, I don't see. I've never seen an interview with him that I felt like, oh, I came away knowing something more that I needed to know that I couldn't have Googled, you know? So I think that for me, everybody, but there are people who make shows where they do always talk to the haters, as I would say. That's not my show. And I think that I don't regret the things I've done on the show, but yes, I would do lots of things differently just because I'm a person who is hard on myself and feels like I could have always been better. But yeah, I don't think at this point in America, I think it's more about getting the microphone in front of the people who have been affected by these things instead of getting the microphone in the people who are doing the damage.
But I guess, do you ever wonder that if, I guess, by choosing like not to interview people from certain groups, like, or even they're from like conspiracy theorist groups or far right wing groups, that just by ignoring the problem it could get worse, or like I guess focusing attention to them, like it could perhaps get worse to the point where you actually have to like speak to them at some point?
I mean, I don't think I'm only talking to people who I agree with. I think that the show has shown over time, and even if we're not in absolute combat about how we're talking, there's still a sense of like, I don't know where you're coming from or your context and the things you think about. I mean, we did an episode about Muslims in small town America. It was in Detroit and Hamtramck, and it was really important to me to address the fact that there's the idea of homophobia in the Muslim community. And so we talked to young millennial Muslims about homophobia, and they were very clear that they don't believe that they think homosexuality is not a part of Islam. They were very clear about that. They were also very reasonable. That in a sense of like, we weren't yelling, we weren't fighting. They just told their thing. I said what I said, and then later in the episode, we talked to an openly gay Muslim, another millennial who was openly gay and practicing Islam. To me, those conversations can all happen. We can talk about the other side. It's just about finding a version of the other side that is not there for clicks. I think that's the thing I'm avoiding, is people where it's like, you showed up for clicks, you didn't show up for conversation. The only time we've ever cut an interview out of the show that I was like, that will never air, is when I was like, oh, this person came here for clicks, they didn't come here for conversation.
Or like clickbait, or just trying to abuse your platform to give themselves like more fame in a way.
Yeah, I think it's funny because I'm like, this doesn't air live, right? I get to decide whether or not I put the
it's like I have control, you don't. Okay.
There was a time I didn't have control, but now I have control. But I'm not afraid of conversations where we disagree. I also know that there's a lot of bad actors out there who don't actually even care about the point they're making. They're just there to promote themselves. And so I think that, like, now, is Richard Spencer that? Well, I think, again, we're talking about different points in history. I think there was a reason to sort of go, what is the alt-right movement? And at the end of the day, I feel like my interview was one of the things that made him look like a paper champion. Like, he's not really that deep. I feel like I was a part of that. I also had to take the slings and arrows of the left. And it's like, well, that's, Mama said there'd be days like this.
Yeah. And I also want to know, in terms of, well, of course, now that you have like an executive producer role like on the show, like in one of your episodes, like you do mention, like in the What Do We Talk About When We Talk About White Supremacy, you mentioned how the media bias in terms of like, even no matter, for some journalists, like no matter how diverse their stories are, it's still being filtered through a white lens oftentimes, because like the people in power or people who are usually in charge, like news editors, publishers, like managers, they're still typically like white, and more often than not, they're probably like white males. And so I just want to know, and one of the things that you mentioned that kind of like stood out to me is that you said, well, Black people need to be in these roles in order for us to change the culture or have like, be able to change the landscape. So yeah, in what ways can, I guess, young journalists or even like people of color, journalists of color, like get to that point to where it's just like, when can we like get the stories that we want out there and not have it like blocked by those who are above us. Yeah.
Well, one thing is I think understand that we're at a time where it is much easier to build your own platform. That if you are telling stories that are compelling, even if you're telling them on a WordPress site or a Twitter thread, you can get it out there. So I think that like in that same episode, we talked to Damon Young, who runs the website Very Smart Brothers, and it's certainly a journalism website and it's certainly an opinion website. And he built it himself, and then later got bought by another site that was like, "Oh, we need some of this." So if you can come through the door as somebody who's already a voice, as opposed to somebody who's trying to build a voice for another platform, that's always better. I think I always talk about Issa Rae, Issa Rae Rae from who had the YouTube channel Misadventures of an Awkward Black Girl, or The Adventures of an Awkward Black Girl, and she built up this thing on YouTube, this show on YouTube, and then later HBO was like, "Hey, could you do that over here? But we'll give you money and you'll be an executive producer." I don't believe that she would have been able to pitch that to HBO without the fact she had built it up on YouTube, or if she had, they might have hired her as talent and then had somebody in charge of her to tell her own story, which has happened throughout years and years of show business. Somebody will buy your story from you and then tell you how to tell your story. So I think that right now, certainly, if you want a job at one of these legacy media outlets, that's fine. But the best thing you can do is be building up your voice in a way that they come get you instead of you applying for a job there.
So,
And then I think if you come in with power, then you get to actually be in a place of telling them what you'll do instead of being told what to do.
So yeah, moral of the story, like build up your own platform, or at least try to build up your own platform as much as possible, and they'll come to you, not the other way around.
There's no reason not to. Like whenever I talk to people who are in media, and I'm like, I'm like, what's your Twitter? I don't do that. Oh, okay. What are you on Instagram? I don't. That's what this stuff is for. It is definitely not for like just sort of having fun conversation with your friends, because there's too much hate on those platforms for that to happen easily. So for me, it's like it better be about, like, if you're in media and if you're a journalist, it better be about building up your platform, building up your voice, and also it's a way to test market what your voice is before somebody's paying you to do it. So by the time somebody from one of these older legacy outfits comes, you can have really know exactly what your voice is in a way that you wouldn't know if you started there as some sort of like junior intern.
And you just mentioned, like you said, hate on the platforms, and I also want to know, how do you deal with, how do you handle like negative people like online when they're saying like racist things to you, or because you talk a lot about race, and some people might say like, why are we still having this conversation? Is that all you talk about, or how do you handle that?
I mean, if I can have fun with it, I will engage, but that's what the block button is for. I'm like, oh, you don't like this conversation? I sort of like the idea when people come to troll me and they come back and they're like, wait, where did he go? Like, yeah, like it is certainly, sometimes it can hurt your feelings. It can be frustrating because I'm married to a white woman. People like to come at me about my relationship a lot, and I don't really have any time to try to negotiate with you on social media. So the ability to block people, because there's enough conflict in my life that I don't need to bring in more conflict. Sometimes if a troll is like, if I think of a funny thing to say, I'll do it because that's for me. That's not for you. Like and that's also, I'm a comedian. I like to say inappropriate things, and it's fun to make people confused, or even sometimes make people get to end up apologizing because you're like, what is wrong with you? So, but yeah, I think it's, for me, you have to be really, the faster you're able to hit that block button, the better your mental health will be.
And one of the things I really did want to talk about, I don't want to like not have this conversation and not mention like the idea of college. First of all, you were a college student once, and I'm pretty sure, for
several years.
Yeah, for several years. And of course, like as a college student, oftentimes, like, especially like for me too, we're asked, to find a major or choose a specialty and like find a stable career path. But you decided, you ended up leaving early and decided to pursue a career in comedy. Like, how did you know that would like work out? Like, did you just trust your instincts? It's like, I'm done with UPenn. I'm just gonna go jump into stand-up comedy.
Yeah.
Sorry, Mom.
I'd been at UPenn for about a year and a half, and then somebody's like, Donald Trump graduated from here. And I'm like, what? Oh, I got to get out of here. This was in the early 90s. I was early to the anti-Trump train. But, just kidding. what happened is like I wanted to go to a big school in an urban environment, and UPenn was that. And it was only after I realized later, wait, this is an Ivy League school. I was like, can I even get in here? I did get in. So congratulations to me. I'm very smart.
Yeah.
And but then once I went there for a major for East Asian Studies. At the time, if you'd ask me why, I'd be like, cause I take a lot of martial arts classes and I like Bruce Lee. Uh, and when I realized that that wasn't it, as often happens to students when they get to school and realize their major was not something that they actually want to do, I was like, well, what am I going to do here? And I literally went through the course catalog and just like couldn't find anything that was like a major or even a class that I was like, oh, I would do that. And then it became about like, this is expensive, and this is in the 90s, so it ain't even close to as expensive as it is now. And I just felt like I'm wasting my time here. Like it really just was like, I think that, to me at this point, because college is so expensive, to me it's got to be a thing like if you can only get that knowledge from that place, then that's when you have to go. If there's other ways to get that knowledge, then maybe invest in those other ways, because there are many, and no shade to UC Berkeley's journalism school, as we all know, there are many journalists out there who are professional, who are acclaimed, who did not go to journalism school. So I think that and I'm not saying don't go to journalism school. I'm saying just figure out why you're there and make sure you're there for a reason. Because as the way the system is constructed now, you're probably going to end up owing a lot of money. And nobody goes into journalism to get rich, as far as I understand it. So I think
It's
that
a calling.
it's a calling. And so, and it may be that it is a calling, and I think it's great if you go, I need to go to that place because these professors are there and I need that knowledge, but just be clear about what you're doing. I think that's the big thing is like, I'm not anti-college. My wife, Melissa, is a PhD in critical dance studies. She's got an MFA in experimental dance choreography. So I'm pro education, but I also was like, she knew I want a PhD in dance because of what that means for my career. So she went there, and she would go get another PhD if we had the time to do it right now, if we weren't scrambling with Zoom learning. But I think that like I'm understanding that like it's clearly, Black people couldn't have accomplished all we've accomplished in this country if we only could have accomplished it from college. Because because we were not allowed to go to college for many years, or we weren't allowed to go to the colleges that white people said were the good colleges. And even now, we still can't always get into those colleges because they have so many legacy people who need to get in there.
That's a whole other conversation too. Yeah, it's like a lot to dig into deep about that. Kind of really like what I wanted to talk to you about too. Like when talking about, of course, like race and journalism. And I'm pretty sure, like after you left college, did you ever think that like, oh yeah, now I'm going to be talking like about these issues as like a career? And of course, you're within like a media space. You're now like with CNN, and you're working kind of like almost in the field of journalism, but of course you still have like your comedy background too. So I guess I wouldn't say like it's come full circle, but you probably did not think that you'd probably end up where you are now.
As I've said this before, like I was not a little kid going, one day I hope to be a comedian so I can have a TV show on CNN. That was not even something I could have conceived of. I was a little kid going, Eddie Murphy is funny, Saturday Night Live is funny, I want to do that. And the thing that I think I did a good job of is then following my nose when I was like, what's that over there? Let me just go see what that is. I used to sit on my wife Melissa's couch in Oakland and watch Anthony Bourdain. Bourdain is Bourdain on the Travel Channel. And I was like, man, that's a cool job. Traveling around and talking to people. I want to do that. But instead of food, I want to do race. But there's no place to apply for that job. And the funny thing is I didn't apply for the job on CNN. They were looking for a host of a show. And I came up as a person who was like, they wanted a Black comedian. And I came up as a Black comedian who could talk about politics and political issues and race issues. And so that's the thing, is like following my nose and sort of pursuing things. I'm like, this seems interesting. I don't know if it's going to make money, but I like this, has been the best thing I've done. And also at some point you have to pay rent, and you have to be an honest critic of yourself and say, I went down this path, it didn't work. And you have to sort of make choices where like, it feels like this is a wrong choice, but I know it for me, it feels like the right choice. So I'm going to do that. So I think it's about being your own biggest cheerleader and also your own harshest critic. It's sort of an equal measure. And so I ended up with a show like Anthony Bourdain had, but not even really trying to get it, but just sort of always having in my head that was a thing that I thought I wanted to do.
And that's amazing too, and I'm so glad that you have it because, again, like I said, I'm a big fan. I've learned so much from it, and I do hope that people who are watching it learn from it too, especially in your other platforms that you have. Of course, you have your own podcast, and you still do your stand-up comedy. Like, you managed to find time to do all of that.
No,
but
stand-up comedy is kind of a wrap for COVID, so I don't know for me personally.
or maybe Zoom comedy. I don't.
Nope, can't. No, I've been invited to do Zoom stand-up comedy shows, and I'm like, I can't do that. So
without
yeah, I don't
having
know.
the audience there.
We'll see. Post-vaccine, post my own comfort level, we'll see what stand-up comedy looks like. But I don't think I'll be back on those stages till 2022 at the earliest.
Yeah. And again, before we move on to audience questions, I do have one to ask. Like, of course, now as like moving forward, now that we're okay, we have a new president-elect, but even then, like in terms of how the media landscape is, how we're still like in a polarized nation. So, like, where people don't trust, like, again, people don't trust journalists, or they still see like the media as the enemy. And so, and also in a way in relation to race, and this is kind of going into like race too, how the media kind of enforces the way that we see others. Like, you talk about this on your show, like in terms of like racial biases. So I guess moving forward, like how can that improve like on the media landscape? How I guess Black people are portrayed, how people of color are portrayed. Just improving that aspect and the way that the media approaches like the topic of race and like racial issues.
I mean, I think it really becomes about those of us who get through the door have to hold the door open for other people like us, and whether that means other Black people or other oppressed groups. So for me, it's like one of the things I'm most happy about with my career is that I've helped other people find roles in show business that maybe they wouldn't have found as easily, or maybe they wouldn't have been looked at for, because I'm like, because I'm like, I know how hard it is to be in this space. And I also know when I got to this space, there weren't a lot of people like me, or people who I was friends with before I got here. So I got to try to bring those people through. So I think it becomes really key. And that's why in the Pittsburgh episode of United Shades of America, I talk about like Oprah and Michael B. and Ryan Coogler and Tyler Perry. It becomes important, and those people, I'll do that to bring other people through. Oprah was key into sort of like bringing Ava DuVernay through, DuVernay, DuVernay, through the door, and sort of supporting her once she got through the door. For me, it's like, that's the thing I think is on us who get through the door. And even if you're a student at UC Berkeley, whether you see it that way or not, you're through the door. You're through a door. And then it becomes, while you're at UC Berkeley, what can I do to make it easier for other people like me to get to this door? So I think those of us who get into privileged positions have to be aware that we can't just come through the door and let it close behind us. I think that's the big thing. So the more we sort of claim our power, and in this moment, post George Floyd, post like sort of a new Black Lives Matter moment, we have to make as much noise as possible about like, we're not going to let you forget this moment. We're not going to look up in a year after there's a vaccine and you're all back to your Zumba classes that everything's and you're back to going to after work drinks or whatever you're doing. You forgot that America went through this summer. And so for me, I think it's those of us, and especially in journalism, to keep telling those stories and keep banging the drum for that, because America has, much like the guy from Memento, America doesn't have a lot of memory. It's not good at long-term
We're easy
memory.
to forget, but that's a good thing that we have that as a reminder. So I'm going to move on to audience questions. We do have one coming in, and this person asks, how do you and your team develop the stories for your season, and do you create an editorial calendar? So is there like an overarching theme for the stories for the season?
No, I mean, what happens is we sort of come up with a bunch of ideas. So there's 8 episodes in a season, and we may come up with 20 to 25 ideas. Some of them are very clear, like we knew this season we had to do one about policing, even though we did one about policing before, but it felt like we need to readdress policing in America because of George Floyd, as we talked about, and so many others, Rashad Brooks and Breonna Taylor. So we need to do another episode about policing. We also were like, it was interesting. We were like, well, how do we do an episode about activism? And as we were sort of conceiving this, Portland became like sort of the America's hub of activism, or as far as in the media. So we went to Portland and shot an episode about activism. So there's some things that the news sort of assigns you as homework. And then there's things where like different members of the crew will be like, I want to do something about this. then what I always start to notice is the themes that connect all these things. So in some sense, we've shot 4 episodes so far, I think, and every one of them has something about policing in it. Just by the nature of, like, if you're talking, one is about policing, one's about activism, so that's about policing. One is about Black people trying to conceive a new future, so it's about tech and Afrofuturism. And one of the reasons they have to conceive a new future is policing. Like, how do we? So, it's ways in which themes emerge that we don't really connect necessarily, like, because we're not. It's not built like a season of, like, you know, Lovecraft Country. We're not pushing towards a season finale, but it is a thing that, like, I will talk about. Yeah, like last season I felt like capitalism kept emerging, and so this season it seems like policing keeps emerging. So yeah, it's not something we're not trying to make the episodes connect, because really they're sort of made to be watched individually, and there's not any, and we also don't know when they're going to air. CNN ultimately determines what the order is, so we don't really do it in a way of like watch them in this order.
And then we have another question coming in that says, are there particular journalists that you admire and think are doing a particularly good job that you look up to?
Oh man, if I have to spell these names, it's gonna be Sarah Seidner. So Sarah with no H, Sara Seidner, Sidner. This is a hard one, just because I haven't spelt it before. Yamiche Alcindor.
Oh yeah, from PBS.
Yes, on PBS. Yamiche, Yamiche, Alcindor, Alcindor, I believe. So Sarah works at CNN, and it was in the white supremacy episode. And I didn't know Sarah. I just know, but since I watch a lot of CNN because I work there, I would just always see her covering stories like I would cover, but she was actually talking to, like, you know, she was in the middle of it, as I said, as I'd say, I can't swear, but in the middle of the S. She was in the middle of like
the situation. She saw it up front.
Like, she gets sent out to the places where it's going down, you know.
Yeah.
There's a moment that she had in Minneapolis where she talked to the Black police chief of Minneapolis and had George Floyd's family on the phone, and she sort of connected them for a moment. And so Sarah's somebody who, in some sense on TV, she is the journalist that you think that sort of is trying to get all sides of the story. But if you pay attention, you know, she actually cares. And we talked about it on the show, and she got mad at me because she said I made her cry on the show, and I
saw that part. Yeah.
I just asked questions. So Sarah is somebody who is working in mainstream journalism, but is actually doing a lot of big work. And Yamiche Alcindor, I say, you know, to be a Black woman, to be a White House correspondent, and to have several times had President Trump disrespect her live on national television, and she doesn't blink, she doesn't bend, she just sits there and does her job. And I think the amount of strength and power she has to have, and Black women in general have to have in this country, is not spoken of enough. We're talking about it a lot more now because of specifically what Black women did in Georgia to flip that state. But I just think I look at that and go, I couldn't do that. As much as I have disdain for President Trump, if he did that to me live on TV, I'd be like, stop being so mean. Stop being so mean. So yes.
Yeah. And another one that we have is, how do you feel when you hear Oakland described, because, you know, you live in the Bay Area, when you hear Oakland described by national media, what are they getting wrong?
I think national media, when they describe any town that is not New York City, is always that thinks the thing that they're talking about defines the entire town. So I think that, you know, we did this episode in Portland, like I said, and on the national media, it looked like Portland was just a gang fight from morning to night. And if you go to Portland, that was happening in about 4 square city blocks, and it was only happening for a couple hours of the night. It wasn't happening. So there were people in Portland who thought it was happening all over Portland when it was really only happening downtown for the most part. So I think that, I think the things that I get frustrated with about Oakland is when it's described as, and this is all sort of pre-pandemic, as a great place to live that doesn't account for the fact that if you move here, you're actually ruining why it's a great place to live. Yeah. So especially if you're moving here to turn it into the kind of place you want to live in. I think when I moved back from New York, me and my wife lived in New York for 2 years when I had my first TV show, and we moved back and saw all this stuff about Oakland being the new Brooklyn. And it was like, Oakland doesn't need to be the new Brooklyn. Oakland is doing fine being Oakland. So I think there's ways in which Oakland is always described as being like another city or or a new place for young people to live in, that because it's cheaper than San Francisco. And the one thing that's happened with the pandemic is a lot of those young people who are living here with that tech money, now that they're on Zoom all day, are realizing they can go back, they can go home, or they can
Yeah.
move to Wyoming and do the work with a strong Wi-Fi connection. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with Oakland. And also a lot of the older businesses in Oakland are going to disappear because of the pandemic. So it'll be interesting what happens. It'll be interesting and tragic to see what happens. And I hope Oakland, I believe in Oakland. I'll just say that.
That's good. And keeping the culture of Oakland and Oakland too.
Yes.
We have another one here that says, you've been mostly discussing political journalism. How are you observing issues of race being addressed successfully and unsuccessfully in other areas of journalism, such as music journalism, for instance?
I think a friend of mine asked me the other day, he's a little bit older than me. He actually works on United Shades, and he was like, basically like, what happened to music journalism now that we're not all reading magazines with music journalism? And the thing that I was like, there's a lot more music journalism, and a lot of it's on YouTube. Like, I think people who wonder about like what happened to this thing, it has migrated to YouTube, and there's more people talking about the thing that you wish people talked about in mainstream journalism. So I find some of the best music journalism is happening on YouTube with people who may not be famous, but who have a commitment to talking about the kind of music they like. I was just listening to, I wish I could remember the name of it's a YouTube channel. But it's like a handful of black guys sitting around all in masks because of COVID, which is, I'm like, that, first of all, that's great. Just a bunch of black dudes respecting COVID is great to put out in the world. And they were talking about Busta Rhymes' new album, and I'd have to look it up, but it's like, and it's for like a half hour, a very deep divey, credible talk about Busta Rhymes' new album, Busta, Busta, rhymes, like the word rhymes. So, and I think that so there's a lot of great music journalism out there. There's a lot of great TV journalism out there. If you want it, you have to go find it. I think stop expecting it to show up to you in the traditional channels in a way you want it to be.
And then you kind of mentioned this earlier on in the conversation, but another person did ask, have there been moments in your career where comedy did not seem to meet the moment, or where you've grappled with comedy's ability to downplay serious harms?
I've been doing comedy long enough that I was a comedian after 9/11 happened. And I remember just being like, there was this sort of like, maybe comedy doesn't exist anymore. And and slowly things came back around. But I really look back in that time, like, I don't remember how I got through that, because it really felt like we were irrelevant. I don't think I would feel that way. I didn't feel that way this summer after George Floyd was killed. I didn't feel that way after the pandemic hit. I felt like, oh, I got stuff to say. So I think that like not every comedian is going to meet the moment, but comedy will meet the moment. And I remember after 9/11, one of the first comedians I saw was Lewis Black, Lewis, Black like the color. Lewis Black performing in San Francisco. He had flown from New York because he was supposed to be in San Francisco to do shows, and it just so happened that he lived in New York. 9/11 happened. He finally got a flight out from New York so he could do some shows in San Francisco. And to see Lewis Black, a very political comedian, on stage talking about something that had happened like a few days before, it's one of the most powerful things I've ever seen. So I think that like comedy in general will always meet the moment, but not every comedian is capable of meeting that moment, and we shouldn't expect them to.
And we do have time for one more, and just to kind of wrap this all up, I did want to ask you, what advice would you give to young journalists, specifically young journalists or journalists of color, just getting started in the news media?
Again, build your platform. Don't be afraid to make some mistakes and get better at it. Don't be afraid to put content out there. And don't be afraid to try lots of different venues. Maybe you're going to be big on TikTok. Maybe you're going to be on Instagram stories. Maybe you're going to be big on fleets on Twitter. I don't know. Or maybe you're going to be writing deep dive long articles. But just try a lot of things and start building your platform yesterday. Because one day that platform that doesn't seem like it's that big a deal now may be something that somebody either wants to hire you from, or wants to buy outright from you, or wants to buy and then have you run. So I would say start making mistakes and putting out content earlier than later, so that you don't have to depend on the halls of power for your voice, and they can actually and it can be the other way around. They will have to depend on you.
Well, Thank you so much, Kamau, for coming to this conversation discussing race in journalism. So happy to have you here. Again, this was brought to you by City Arts and Lectures and the School of Journalism. And yeah, be safe where you're going. And, you know, we look forward to these new episodes that you're going to be filming of United Shades. And yeah, wear a mask. That's an important thing too.
I'm all masked up, everybody.
All masked up. All right. Thank you so much, Kamau.
Thank you.
Thank you.